No, I'm just giving a check 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 23 18 Rayburn check 1 2 3 4. Good.
We have a motion on the, or a vote on the floor. It's just a motion to adjourn. Should be, with hope, won't be followed by any more substantive things. So rather than convene and then race away, what we'll do is we'll just, all of us try to go vote as quickly as we can and come right back and convene immediately after this vote. I apologize for the interruption, but appreciate the patience of our witnesses and others present. So we hope to, perhaps with luck, get started by as early as 1:10, 1:15. So don't go too far. Thanks. I appreciate, well, we'll get our witnesses there. They are. I was about to start without witnesses. Hearings go much faster that way, I have found. That's good. I thank our witnesses. Will be joined shortly by additional members who are coming from the vote. Our hearing will now come to order. I want to welcome today's hearing, everyone to today's hearing on new roadmaps for wind and solar research and development. One moment, please. I heard Mr. Inglis was coming, and I had to pause because I know he hates to miss opening statements, them they being so important. Today's hearing will explore research and development needs for both wind and solar energy technologies. The U.S. has great potential for expanding the use of both renewable energy resources. According to a study by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, accessible wind potential in just 12 states could power the entire country twice over. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has also shown that if we cover just 1/4% of a total U.S. land area with currently available solar panels, we could meet all of our nation's energy needs. In order to realize this potential, however, considerable investments are required. We need significant upgrade to our transmission grid and to move beyond fossil fuels and address the growing threat of climate disruption or overheating and ocean acidification. These domestic energy options must receive additional support. Wind and solar technologies have progressed over the last several decades to a point where cost competitiveness with fossil fuels is considered achievable, and paths toward this goal can be laid out in detail. Today we will hear from an excellent panel of witnesses on the concrete steps government and the private sector can take to overcome the technical and economic barriers that wind and solar still face in the U.S. We will also receive testimony on H.R. 3165, the Wind Energy Research and Development Act of 2009. The bill was recently introduced by our friend and colleague, Mr. Tonko, to establish a more comprehensive research, development, and demonstration program at the Department of Energy. I believe this bill goes a long way towards helping wind power reach its full potential. I thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee this afternoon, and with that, I recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Inglis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. South Carolina, like much of the country, is suffering in this economic downturn. Our unemployment rate is at an all-time high of 12.1%. Thankfully, though, General Electric's turbine facility is helping to cushion the impact in the upstate of South Carolina, where about 1,500 engineers and 1,500 production employees are designing and building wind turbines and advanced gas turbines. Doubling worldwide production of wind energy will generate $100 billion in sales for the wind industry. So I'm very excited about improving the domestic wind energy industry. The U.S. was an early leader in photovoltaic power, in large part due to our robust space technology. Government policy and strong market signals have since increased solar energy installation and manufacturing capacity in other nations, and we have fallen behind. American companies are poised, though, to reclaim leadership in renewable energy technology and revitalize our economy through innovation. Well-focused research dollars can support long-term research to keep us ahead of the development curve and can spur opportunity and growth in the private sector. The renewable electricity industry faces a number of important research topics. Wind energy in particular will improve through wind forecasting capacities, increase turbine efficiency, and reduce capital costs, all of which will make wind farms easier to site and cheaper to build and operate. Both wind and solar energy face a hurdle in terms of reliability. Energy storage systems that convert intermittent renewable capacity into baseload power source will be necessary to move beyond our dependence on fossil fuel energy. Once we've addressed these obstacles, we are still left with the aging and inefficient electricity grid geared to centralized generation at conventional power plants. I'm glad we'll have a chance to address that critical challenge in our next subcommittee hearing. I'm looking forward to hearing from these witnesses, Mr. Chairman, about ways to reshape and properly focus our renewable energy research dollars. And I thank you again for holding the hearing.
I thank the chair. If there are other members who wish to, or thank Mr. Inglis. If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. It's my pleasure to introduce our witnesses at this time. Mr. Steve Lockhart is CEO of TPI Composites and co-chair of the American Wind Energy Association, AWEA Research and Development Committee. Mr. Ken Zweibel, I'm reminded here by my staff, rhymes with Bible. Thank you, staff. Is the director of George Washington University Solar Institute. Ms. Nancy Bacon, a famous name in science, Francis Bacon, of course, would be an apt quote to put up on one side or the other. Probably that side would be safer. Is a senior advisor for United Solar Ovonic and Energy Conversion Devices Incorporated. I will at this point yield to my distinguished colleague, to Mr. Tonko, to introduce our witness from Albany, New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to introduce a constituent from the capital region of New York, John St. Cross. John is the program manager of Energy and Environmental Markets at New York State's Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA. He's currently responsible for managing the centralized procurement of renewable resources under the Renewable Portfolio Standard in New York and the auctions and sales of allowances under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and Clean Air Interstate Rural Programs. Mr. St. Cross is a member of New York State's Nuclear Assessment and Evaluation Team, which is responsible for conducting evaluations of physical reactor plant conditions and plant personnel responses to unusual or emergency reactor and other plant system events. Before assuming these current responsibilities at NYSERDA, John managed various renewable technology product development and deployment activities, including those associated with the development of green power markets. He was the Director of Resource Portfolio Management for Green Mountain Power Corporation, where his responsibilities included the development of renewable and distributed power technologies, integrated generation and demand planning, and power contracting, delivery, and trading. He also led the effort working with Electric Power Research Institute and the Department of Energy to develop one of the nation's first utility-owned wind projects for the testing of large-scale pre-commercial turbines located in Searsburg, Vermont. And I do want to welcome him here today and also speak to the issues of character, because he's a great volunteer with Habitat for Humanity, which I think says volumes for the crew at NYSERDA. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. I will yield to our other colleague, Mr. Neugebauer, to introduce his fellow Texan and our final witness.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my honor to be able to introduce a great educator, researcher, and leader in science and engineering. Dr. Andy Swift is the director of the Wind Science and Engineering Research Center at Texas Tech, which is home to America's only doctoral granting program in wind science engineering, and located in my district as well. His previous employment included more than 20 years as professor of mechanical engineering at University of Texas, El Paso, the last 7 of which was the dean of the College of Engineering. He completed his engineering graduate work, obtaining a Doctor of Science degree at Washington University in St. Louis, where he began conducting research in wind turbine engineering with a focus on dynamics and aerodynamics of wind turbine rotors. Dr. Swift has worked in wind energy for over 25 years and has over 100 published articles and books, chapters in the area of wind turbine engineering, renewable energy, and in 1995 he received American Wind Energy Society Academic Award for continuing contributions to wind energy technology as teacher, researcher, and author. It's my privilege to welcome a true pioneer in renewable energy and recognized leader in the engineering of wind energy development. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for
Thank you, Mr. Neugebauer. I should mention that we also are joined today by Dr. Bartlett and Dr. Ehlers. Dr. Ehlers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Even though she doesn't live in my district, she does have a plant very close to my district, and I have to recognize Nancy Bacon, and the firm she represents has been far and away the leader in solar electric panels in the nation. And, they hired her because she can bring the bacon home. And so we're pleased to have her here, too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. We also have Ms. Edwards and Ms. Giffords, both outstanding members of this committee as well. Thank you for being here. And with that, as our witnesses should know, you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Please do your best to keep around that. We try to be fairly rigorous on that. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you have completed your spoken testimony, we'll begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses after that point. We'll start with Mr. Lockhart. Please proceed.
Good afternoon. Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Inglis, distinguished members of this subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. Our company, TPI Composites, is a manufacturer of large wind turbine blades for leading turbine makers, including GE and Mitsubishi. We're headquartered in Scottsdale, Arizona. TPI operates wind-related factories in Rhode Island, Mexico, China, and most recently, Newton, Iowa. In addition to my role with TPI, I also co-chair the R&D Committee for the American Wind Energy Association, on whose behalf I'm testifying today. Before proceeding, I would like to thank Congressman Tonko for sponsoring legislation to authorize a comprehensive research, development, and demonstration program for wind energy. AWEA and TPI endorsed this legislation and urge members to support its passage. Representative Tonko's legislation authorizes wind energy R&D at a level that will allow the wind industry to significantly improve turbine reliability and reduce capital costs. Combined with a strong national renewable electricity standard and broader transmission, cost allocation, planning, and siting policies, greater R&D funding will increase wind energy production and lead to the creation of more high-paying jobs across our country. Last year, at a time when most U.S. industries were shedding jobs, the wind industry added 35,000 jobs and deployed over 8,500 megawatts. This record growth amounted to more than 40% of the country's new electric generating capacity in that year. However, our job is far from complete. Wind power is still constrained by difficulties in market acceptance and needed improvements in cost, performance, and reliability. The $70 million approved by the House Appropriations Committee for Wind Energy R&D, combined with funds that will be provided through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, will finance a number of key wind industry priorities. However, in order to fully address all of the key wind energy R&D and deployment challenges, a sustained annual budget of at least $200 million is needed. The Department of Energy's 20% by 2030 wind report was released in 2008. The report assumes that capital cost be decreased by 10% and turbine efficiency increased by 15% to reach this achievable goal of providing 20% of our nation's electricity from wind. Meeting this goal will require increased R&D funding. Meeting the 20% goal will provide a host of benefits, including supporting 500,000 jobs and generating over $1 trillion in economic impact by 2030, decreasing natural gas prices by approximately 12%, avoiding 825 million tons of CO2 emissions in 2030, equivalent to 25% of the electric sector emissions, and reduce cumulative water consumption in the electric sector by 17% in 2030. Increased R&D funding will bring down capital costs and increase turbine efficiency to help realize these benefits and keep America's wind industry competitive with other electric generation sources and the wind industries of other countries. Last year, as part of an AWEA R&D committee effort, a team of over 80 AWEA members and advisors from industry, government, and academic institutions worked over several months to develop a specific action plan and funding proposal to meet our 20% goal. Participants determined that $217 million in annual federal funding, combined with $224 million in annual industry and state cost share, would be necessary to support the R&D and related programs. The group determined 201 of the 217 should be directed toward the DOE. AWEA and the wind industry support funding for this action plan. AWEA also recognizes the need to reduce the cost of offshore wind energy technology to provide an estimated 54 gigawatts of the 300 gigawatts needed to meet the 20% goal by 2030. AWEA recommends funding for programs that focus on the power system operations issues of integrating variable power sources such as wind into the electric grid. An important component of such integration includes developing and promoting advanced forecasting methods. Another important research area is wind project siting, including better understanding the impact of wind turbines on wildlife and radar installations and mitigating these impacts. While the wind industry is continuing to add new electric generation capacity, a number of challenges still exist. Continued support for wind energy R&D is vital to helping wind become a more prominent energy source that leads to a host of benefits. Continued investments in wind energy R&D are delivering value for taxpayers by fostering the development of a domestic energy source that strengthens our national security, provides economic development, spurs new high-tech jobs, and helps protect the environment. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I'd welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lockhart. Mr. St. Cross, please.
Partnering with businesses, industries, and residents to invest in innovative, environmentally friendly, renewable energy and energy-efficient technologies. Its annual budget of approximately $600 million is funded through multiple sources. NYSERDA currently administers a systems benefits charge based on a small surcharge on utility bills, which is allocated toward energy efficiency programs and R&D development initiatives. Funding from the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, is also a critical part of what we do to lessen our heavy dependence in New York on fossil fuels and reduce harmful air emissions. In addition, NYSERDA expects to realize additional funding for related research through its participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative Carbon Cap and Trade Program. NYSERDA will also be implementing Governor Patterson's 45 by 15 initiative, the most ambitious clean energy program in the nation, which requires that by 2015, 30% of New York's energy will be supplied by renewable resources and 15% from energy efficiency. NYSERDA commends this committee for taking up the issue of wind technology performance and improvement through applied and transformational research and demonstration. NYSERDA is here today to speak to the promise of wind energy and related technology challenges from two perspectives. The first as a user of the technology to satisfy state policy goals, and second as an entity committed to the pursuit of technological advancement for clean energy resources. As the administrator of the RPS program in New York, NYSERDA acts as a user of the technology by centrally procuring, on a competitive basis, the generation of electric energy from qualified renewable resources such as wind power. Out of the state's installed wind generation of 1,275 megawatts, about 1,100 megawatts are supported through the RPS program. By the end of 2009, the state is expected to have satisfied 30% of its renewable energy targets. Wind energy represents over 90% of the energy associated with this program. The state of New York is counting on wind project performance and reliability to satisfy statewide goals. The American Wind Energy Association, AWEA, has clearly identified gaps in research that, left unattended, could prevent the nation from realizing the full potential of its abundant wind resources. NYSERDA believes these challenges are manageable and not unlike challenges other technologies face. The evolution from scientific research and analysis progressing to product and material development, product demonstration and validation, analysis of commercial feasibility, and ultimately to operating practices and codes remains a continuum of integrated activities. It is along this continuum where NYSERDA makes its home. NYSERDA is committed to working with the private sector institutions of higher learning and the federal government to characterize challenges along this continuum and collaborating where appropriate to overcome them. New York is unique in that wind technology will be asked to perform capably on two frontiers, on land and offshore, NYSERDA believes in a research agenda that addresses technology needs on both frontiers, yet sees a pressing need to increase the focus of collective energies toward offshore development. NYSERDA believes increased sophistication and computational modeling of wind resources, fluid flow, and turbulence within turbine arrays will be of near-term benefit to New York and the nation as they pursue ambitious environmental goals. And as such models are extended offshore, such benefits will only grow. For offshore applications, current wind fluid dynamic modeling will need to be extended to the simulation of water and wave motion so that turbines can be designed accordingly and operate reliably. Advances in the development of energy storage technologies that could store wind energy and release it to the electric grid when demanded would help the state and offer similar benefits to other regions in the nation. New York has made a great stride forward in this regard by spearheading a battery energy storage technology consortium that will capitalize on the state's existing technical and industrial capabilities and advance New York's clean energy and storage technology industries. The predominant turbine design in the U.S. is not suited for application offshore. It is widely accepted that turbines for offshore use will be of a larger, on the order of 2 to 4 times the scale now in use for land-based turbines. To migrate to such scale and develop a turbine design specifically for the offshore operating environment will require a bold effort in engineering, prototyping, and testing and manufacturing. In closing, NYSERDA, as a user of wind technology to satisfy New York climate goals, as a science-based research organization focused on the development and commercialization of clean energy technologies, strongly encourages the committee to consider substantially increasing federal funding for wind technology research and development. I thank you again for the opportunity to share our views on this important subject, and will be pleased to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. St. Cross. Dr. Swift.
Good afternoon, and Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the members of the committee for inviting me. It is an honor to testify before this committee. As Congressman Neugebauer mentioned, I'm a faculty member in civil engineering and director of the Wind Science and Engineering Research Center at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. And the center has been in existence for almost 40 years. I've been doing wind research for about 30 myself. And Texas ranks first in wind power installed capacity, and in Lubbock, we're at the geographic epicenter of that development in Texas. And of course, it expands through the southern Great Plains region. Wind is the fastest growing source of bulk electric power in both the United States and the world. And it's a clean, domestic, renewable source of energy, and it uses no water. Most thermal power plants use a lot of water, and I know there have been some committee hearings here before this committee talking about the relationship between energy and water. That's an important fact, I think, as we look about the dispersion of wind through the Great Plains, where water can be scarce. Mr. Lockhart gave a good review of the Department of Energy 20% by 2030 report, and we're at about 28 gigawatts of installed capacity. That report calls for 300 gigawatts of needed capacity, and also talks about not only the need for transmission, but also the need for reduced cost and improved performance and reliability of wind turbines, and about workforce. I'd like to use my last few minutes here to comment on these. On the research for turbine reliability and performance, there's really 2 areas, and I compliment Congressman Tonko for in his bill for distinguishing between those 2. One is individual turbine research, which needs to be done in order to improve components. They talk about improved rotors and to improve generators and improve blades. There's a lot of work that can be done, and those various areas will combine together to provide individual turbine performance enhancement. The second area, which is the development part of the bill, really addresses the array effects of wind turbines. One of the issues for research is that as these turbines are put into large wind farms, the downwind turbines, the ones that are in the second, third, and fourth row, typically don't perform as well as those in the front row. And this is an issue because researchers and folks at the labs, et cetera, our students cannot get access to these turbines because they're all privately held and privately owned. So there's a huge need for a public access to wind farms in order to begin to look at these wake effects and these array effects. Let me talk about the $200 million that's been proposed a year. It's a lot of money. It's a healthy increase, but it's a needed increase. It brings wind on a parity, I think, with some of the other resources. Solar has been pretty close to that range for a number of years. If one were to look at that as an investment, take an investment approach, the 2030 report by DOE calls for about 15 gigawatts per year in order to reach that goal. If one takes that 15 gigawatts and applies a 1% performance improvement, that's all, just 1% to that 15 gigawatts due to this research, and then takes that over the life of the wind farm, net present value of that is about $300 million, given the current costs and with some assumptions. I have those calculations available if anyone's interested. My point is that the leverage of those dollars is significant, and it's because of the huge amount of energy produced from these large wind farms and the value of that energy. I'd like to take my last minute to talk about workforce needs. In the DOE 2030 report, they talk about 180,000 direct jobs that are going to be needed. We've had some economists at Texas Tech take a look at these numbers, and we estimate that about 20 to 25,000 of those jobs will be professional jobs, which will require some kind of university education. The rest will require a 2-year degree in maintenance and oversight of these wind farms, and that effort's going on, as I say, mostly at the 2-year schools. At the university, as Congressman Nogelbauer pointed out, we have the only PhD program in wind science and engineering, something we're proud of, but if we're going to have this kind of development, we need programs across this country. Texas Tech is not going to lead this development all by itself. A number of universities are stepping up, but in order to make this happen, we need to get faculty involved, and research dollars bring faculty, the faculty bring graduate students, the graduate students then innovate, bring new ideas back, new programs are installed, and then that forms the basis for the workforce needs for this industry. I see that my time is up. I again appreciate very much the opportunity to be here. I'm happy to take questions a little bit. My written testimony, which gives us some more details. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Swift. Mr. Survival.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members, for having me. We are pressed by climate change and energy price escalation challenges. In response, we are quite likely to deploy many billions, even trillions of dollars worth of renewables, including solar. This is the path Europe and Japan appear to be on, and of all the future paths, it seems to me the most likely for us, and in my opinion is by far the most sustainable, sensible, and even most affordable. We should ensure that our deployment expectations of these trillions of dollars are supported by technological progress to keep our costs to a minimum. This is especially true of solar, where current costs are higher than other renewables, but potential for cost reductions are faster and greater, and the payoff is greatest because solar is the largest and most widely available energy source on the planet, much larger than fossil fuels. In fact, I suggest a combined deployment of solar and my respected wind colleagues and electric transportation will address our problems successfully. If we can solve our energy problems with solar and wind and electric transportation, they will be solved for a long time to come. If we do not try to connect our solar technology development in government with our deployment expectations, we will be doing ourselves a disservice, paying more and perhaps much more than we should for the same electricity. In addition, we have the responsibility to maximize our domestic competitiveness, since solar can provide a huge harvest of jobs. Our suite of solar technologies is exceptionally rich, and with the proper support should reach cost levels appropriate for deployment sufficient to stabilize energy prices and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That means we do not need any breakthroughs. We have all the technology we need to be able to meet greenhouse gas and energy price stabilization. We are in danger of losing technical leadership in these technologies if we hesitate to support them, misled by claims about nascent futuristic technologies with poor risk profiles. I worked 25 years on solar PV technology development and had the good fortune to be involved with a small DOE program of $5 to $15 million during that period. The thin film PV partnership and its precursors nurtured several second-generation PV technologies from benchtop to multi-billion-dollar annual sales. Two key U.S. companies, Unisolar here to my left and First Solar, were substantial participants in this program. Both are now world leaders in PV. In fact, First Solar was the second largest manufacturer of PV modules in the world last year. When the numbers come in this year, they may be the largest, with over 1 billion watts of module sales and $2 billion in revenue. This is a notable success in a world dominated by foreign, even Chinese competitors that tout low-cost labor as their competitive advantage. In this case, technology is our competitive advantage, and we'd like to keep it that way. We can learn some lessons from the history of First Solar, which was intimately involved with the funding from the Department of Energy during their period of nurturing since 1989. I want to make a point about commitment to excellent technologies. Solar Cells Inc., First Solar's precursor company, was not the first to work in their chosen technology. Before it, Kodak, Amatec, Photon Power, Coors, Matsushita, and BP Solar worked in it and gave up. During that whole time, several universities, including Stanford and Southern Methodist University, were also participating. We at NREL started in about 1985. We stuck with their technology during the corporate ups and downs because we had a technical roadmap based on 3 critical criteria: PV module cost, performance, and reliability. These same criteria are mostly the criteria we all use in everyday matters: cost, performance, and reliability. They're pretty much universal. We were not lost in the technological woods, assuming everything equally worthy of support or jumping from one hot new idea to another. We knew what we needed in a way of manufacturing cost, in a way of output, and in a way of reliability for 30-year life. Knowing where we were going allowed us to stick with technologies through thick and thin and drop those that demonstrated an ability to get there with reasonable risk and cost. We exercised technically knowledgeable judgment, and we got to our goals. Today, First Solar has surpassed all our metrics, and they are now the lowest cost producer of solar PV electricity in the world. They have become a huge spur to progress in solar energy because they are the new benchmark against which everyone is measured. We are fortunate because with this competition, prices will be dropping instead of being static the way they were before they're reaching first tier, becoming a first-tier supplier. Let me thank Ohio Representative Marcy Kaptur for being a champion.
Mr. Fleibel, you've reached about 5 minutes, so I hate to cut you short, but I'm going to ask you to conclude your remarks shortly.
All right. Who was part of this development during this whole period. Technical roadmaps are not magic. They have well-known pitfalls like being too narrowly defined, not allowing enough out-of-the-box thinking, and being parochial. But they are also wonderful in assuring us research focus and highlighting pinch points. Used wisely, they can be a major step forward. Put differently, without them, we are in danger of wandering in the woods from one hot excitement to another, or treating every proposal as of equal value. Adoption of a technical roadmap should be done sensibly.
Mr. Fleibel, I'm going to ask you to conclude at this point.
With openness to frequent revision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fleibel. I apologize for that. Ms. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all the distinguished members of the committee. Very much appreciate being here. It is an honor. I'm Nancy Bacon, of course, senior advisor of a company in Michigan, which is Energy Conversion Devices. Our largest business unit is United Solar Ovonic. It's a global leader in manufacturing of thin film photovoltaics that convert sunlight into clean, renewable energy. As you can see from this small sample that I have, our products are significantly different from the other conventional products. They're typically 18 feet long and 14 inches wide. They contain no glass, which makes them flexible, durable, and extremely lightweight. Perfect for PV rooftop installations. In fact, our products were chosen to do the largest photovoltaic array in the world on a rooftop in Spain with General Motors. I've given a handout to the staff earlier, and you'll see that pictured on page 6. To make our United Solar laminates, we employ about 2,000 people, most of them in Michigan. Since 2006, United Solar has increased its Michigan employment base fourfold. We operate 2 plants in Auburn Hills, Michigan, 2 in Greenville, Michigan, and we are continuing to expand, and we're constructing a 5th plant in Battle Creek. We're one of the few U.S. producers of solar cells and modules. We have a history of innovation. We pioneered the use of roll-to-roll processing for depositing solar cells on 1.5-mile long substrates. We're very interested in the roadmap process, and we very much applaud the committee's commitment to solar energy and support the DOE's solar photovoltaic programs. We also believe that strengthening the government-industry partnership to develop a robust solar power roadmap or solar vision to guide the U.S. research, development, demonstration, and commercial application would be of great value. Such a program, properly funded, would address the national priorities effectively of addressing climate change, enhance U.S. competitiveness, and energy security. We are competing against countries, not companies. Bell Labs invented photovoltaics 54 years ago. Less than a decade ago, we had 40% of the world's PV manufacturing here in the U.S. Today, it is only about 8%. We need to put the nation's scientific, engineering, and innovation talents to work to bring down the cost of solar power and revitalize our manufacturing base. Other countries have visionary policies and making investments that are creating thousands of jobs, and we need to do that as well. Widespread use of solar PV can benefit the climate, the economy, and our security. While addressing the supply side, I think, is critical, we also need as a nation to address the demand side. In particular, we believe that the government should lead by example and install PV roofs on federal buildings and encourage states to do the same. Before offering some specific suggestions, I would like to highlight some of the benefits of using solar photovoltaic for distributed generation to put some of my recommendations in context. Solar rooftops are an ideal place to generate electricity. As this committee well knows, distributed generation simply refers to the generation of electricity at the point of consumption rather than in a remote location. Outlined in my written testimony, the benefits of distributed generation are numerous, and they include better land utilization, reduced strain on our antiquated electrical grid, no transmission or distribution losses, less reliance on foreign oil, and a drop in carbon dioxide production. That's 5 significant benefits in one. If you think about it, rooftops are an ideal place to install photovoltaics. They have no other purpose but to keep the building dry inside. My written testimony outlines my recommendations, and I'd like to highlight a few today. Solar Vision Roadmap should be properly funded to assure the U.S. industry achieves grid parity and the U.S. is competitive with other countries. All costs should be considered in the development of the roadmap and establishing priorities. As the DOE's successful Solar America initiative, focus should be on the lowest cost per kilowatt hour, taking into consideration the installed cost per system and the amount of electricity generated in real-world conditions. Benefits of distributed generation should also have been taken into account, i.e. no land and no transmission and distribution losses, etc. And we should also take into account the benefits of solar during peak times. Health benefits and energy security benefits are also important. If we fund a vigorous program to develop advanced manufacturing technology, I believe this will be critical for the U.S. to help revitalize its manufacturing base and regain leadership in this important field. And this funding should be given priority as well. Finally, I think that the taxpayers' investments should be protected with provisions to ensure technology is developed with taxpayers' money is implemented here in the U.S.
Ms. Bacon, I'm going to ask you to reach a conclusion shortly.
I certainly will. Thank you. The last recommendation I have is really with regard to the demand side. The federal government spends $6 billion annually on electricity. I think they should lead by example, and they could be putting a procurement program in place that would change the way we create electricity, just the way we change the way with the government funding, with the way we communicate with the internet. I think it's critical to success that we move ahead with these programs, and a timely implementation and deployment can have us regain our leadership once again.
I'll ask you to conclude at that point, and we'll have time for questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I apologize to the witnesses. It's always difficult. You have tremendous expertise, and with a large panel, we always have to try to keep it within time. But thank you very much. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, and then we'll proceed in alternating order. I want to recognize Mr. Rohrabacher and Mr. Diaz-Balart for joining us. Thank you, gentlemen, for your participation. I'm so sorry to hear this testimony about the tremendous job loss being created by this industry. We recently passed a comprehensive energy bill, as you know, and one of the criticisms of it is that it will be catastrophic from an employment and an economic perspective. That is not what I've been hearing from the testimony today. Would any of you like to comment on that briefly? Mr. Lockhart, you had some impressive statistics, and others wish to comment. I'd welcome that.
Yeah, I think 2008 represented a terrific year for the wind industry in the U.S. with tremendous growth, 8,500 megawatts, job creation. 2009 is not going to reflect that same growth, by the way. So just so that stat is clear, and things like a federal renewable electricity standard will send a much stronger, consistent, long-term signal. That's an important piece of this in order for companies like ours and others to build more plants, create jobs, and create sustainable long-term jobs, not just the boom-bust cycles that we've had up until now. So while there's a lot of enthusiasm and tremendous opportunity, our job isn't done here. And I think there are several key issues, key opportunities, including a federal RES. A strong, consistent signal would help drive that even stronger.
Thank you. Others wish to comment on the economic development job potential?
Yes, I'd like to very much. We actually have increased our employment in Michigan fourfold since 2006. And we are making excellent progress, and that's going very well. The problem is that we have now, with the recession and with a number of the problems with regard to the finance institutions, things are slowing. So our Battle Creek plant that's under construction, we have put a hold on some of the equipment until things turn around. From a point of view of where we are from a nation, we export 80% of our products. And as I talked about the General Motors facility, that's 12 megawatt, the largest in the world, we created jobs in Michigan by manufacturing the solar laminates, but we created more jobs over in Spain with the installers and the electricians and the construction folks. So I think some of these things to look at the supply side will be very important here, and to move these programs along timely will be also very important. Thank you.
Ms. Bacon, I appreciate that. You'll be pleased to know that the chair of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has made it a passionate pursuit to install solar and other technologies on many federal buildings.
I understand that, and I actually testified in that committee as well, and we were delighted to get a lot of things in the bill. The problem is it hasn't come out of the bill into the bank, and everybody's waiting for it.
Point well said.
We think that with some of the programs that are going on with this committee, too, urgency is really important for the sustainability of this job growth as well. Thank you.
The next line of questioning I'd like to pursue relates to an article in this month's Harvard Business Review. And to all my colleagues, I would really commend this article. It's in Harvard Business Review, and it discusses what happens when U.S. core fundamental research technology gets shifted overseas and we fall off that supply and engineering train. It is directly relevant to your work, and it traces back from everything from the transistor to battery technology, et cetera. And I think it's got the potential. We're seeing it already in renewable energy. And so the question is, how can we not see that happen here? One of the points this article made was, as domestic manufacturers allowed battery technology for cell phones to go overseas, that seemed like, so what, they can do it okay. But now as we want batteries for automobiles, we don't have the technology, the know-how, the manufacturing capacity here. They have it overseas. How can we avoid that? And I will be asking that in this committee for probably many, many months to come of different similar panels. How do we avoid that in the area of renewable energies?
Well, I can take a crack at that as well. It's a little controversial, but as a taxpayer, I feel that if my money goes into investment in developing research and development, advanced technologies, and so on, when my government buys products, I would like to see a preference for U.S. industry. And I also think an advanced manufacturing technology, which is critical to revitalize our manufacturing base here in the U.S. with regard to photovoltaics, the dollars that go there, we should see that those plants are put here. And the other side of it is creating the demand side again. I mean, that makes a difference. Germany is the largest market in the world for photovoltaics. They have less sun than we have in Michigan. And they employ more people in renewable energy now than they do in the automotive industry. And think of it, it's the home of the Mercedes and the VW and so on. And that's because of their policies. And it's both on the supply and on the demand side with this. And I think those kind of policies will make all the difference in the world so we don't see this go the way of the VCR.
I'll be providing a copy of that article to my colleagues. It's a profoundly interesting article and educational for all of us. I will recognize, I'd like to hear more on this, but I'm going to recognize Mr. Inglis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bacon, very exciting to hear about the opportunity on our roofs for distributed electricity generation. Why are people doing that now? Is it cost effective for them, or is it are they leading because of commitment to the environment or stewardship, or what? Because in a lot of places the economics don't exactly work. Is that right? Or
Well, actually, you can put photovoltaics on the roof as economically as you can in many solar farms. And you don't have the land use, you don't have the transmission distribution, which is like 6 to 8%. You don't have to wait for the smart grid, the antiquated grid. There's all those advantages with it. But solar in general, the reason we're all here is we're not to grid parity yet. But we really think it's the future. There was a DOE study that just came out that they think that solar could be 50% building integrated photovoltaics. And the next time you go into an airport, just look at all those roofs that you can put solar on. They can be done in any size. But the problem in industry as general is we're not to grid parity. Hence, we need the stimulus, whether it's procurement via direct payment or power purchase agreements, or the ITC, which has been enacted now, and other things. And as we bring the volume up, we'll bring down the cost. And it's just like anything else. I mean, high technology and low volume is high cost. We're working to grid parity, and we think with the government's help and the DOE's help, and across all agencies, including DOD, we can bring down to be grid parity. In the right location, we are already competitive, but these are 20, 25-year lives. And to find out really competitive, you need your crystal ball to figure out what's the electricity going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now. You'll appreciate I had President Bush come out to see us. He calls me solar woman, but I asked him the same thing. He asked me about the competitiveness, and I asked him, I said, what do you think the price of electricity is going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? And he gave me one of those blank stares, and Karl Rove and Hubbard were there, and I said, well, maybe these guys know. He says, they don't know anything. But I asked you, what is the price of electricity going to be 5 years from now? 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Photovoltaic arrays on your roof will last you 25 years.
yeah, very, very exciting. So I guess the customers that you've got today have obviously made calculations that indicate that they're banking on the price off the grid being considerably higher than it is today, and therefore they make the economic decision, or they make some sort of other considerations go into their decision in buying your product.
Most of them are much tougher than that. Most of them want to have the price today at the same price as the grid, and then there will be an escalation. A lot of the industry is now being done with power purchase agreements, where somebody else buys the power, buys this photovoltaic, like a financier. He takes all the ITC, accelerated depreciation, et cetera, and then he has a 20, 25-year power purchase agreement. General Motors is a good example. We have a 1 megawatt installation in California. Their initial price started out at 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and then it escalates each year a certain percentage. They're all banking on what that's going to be, but that initial price was pretty close to what the parity was at that point in time. But the only reason that worked was because of the incentives, the ITC and some of the other incentives with it.
Does that mean you're basically selling to people with big roofs? Is that It needs to be a pretty big roof at this point?
No, it can be done of any size. What we have done as a company, we're a small company. We have 2,000 people, and we're a Michigan-based company. We typically have tried to sell very large arrays just because it's easier to sell than going to each household, which maybe wants 2,500 kW or something small. It's a lot easier to sell a megawatt or a 12-megawatt array. But we will be coming out with the end of this year a program for small households, and they can also end up being cost effective in the long term. And I believe in the long term, I'm old enough, the reason I'm senior advisor, I'm old. My mom had a telephone in her house that was owned by AT&T. Why not have photovoltaics on our roof that's owned by the local utility, and they could manage it and they could take care of it, and it wouldn't take any space up. You generate the electricity right when you need it. So there's a lot of innovation here, both from the basic materials, the product design, the manufacturing, and even the financing and marketing mechanisms. And that's why I applaud some of the things that people are looking at in this solar vision and roadmap. It's not just looking at efficiencies to have technical papers. It's looking at the whole program to be cost effective and really have the energy security, climate, and economic benefits we're all looking forward to having.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Inglis. Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For our wind experts on the panel, it becomes more and more apparent that offshore wind holds great potential, not just for the wind portion of our energy supplies, but really expanding the opportunities for renewables in general. Can you cite what sort of efficiencies might be achieved, what sort of focus might become critical with R&D investment in the offshore component?
Yeah, first off, on the 20% by 2030 report, 300 gigawatts would be the total installed base for wind by 2030. 54 of the 300 is considered to be offshore, so something like 18-20% of the total 20% number would be offshore. It was also viewed to be a bit later in the 22-year cycle. So the problems today are cost, siting related, similar to land-based, but probably magnified in terms of the cost problem and the siting problem. There's probably more of an opportunity in offshore for innovation to drive a breakthrough change, whereas the land-based product, it seems, is pretty much dialed in. The improvements are cost, performance, reliability, but probably not breakthrough. I think the breakthrough opportunities may extend themselves even better in the offshore side. So in our funding, the $217 million request, 15 of that was related to offshore specific technology. Other pools as well would go toward offshore. I think our group is growing in the view that offshore can represent a significant part of the wind future, particularly New England and the Gulf Coast, and it should be an important source of innovation.
Mr. St. Cross, in your testimony, you talked about the difficulty and the expense of installing a meteorological mast with a pier-type foundation driven into the seabed. How crucial is it that we discover a more efficient alternative for that portion of wind to work?
Well, first, you're going to need to put many towers up if you're going to try to see the kind of offshore development that folks are talking about. A meteorological tower now runs about $4 million to $6 million to site it and physically install it. And then you have to hope that it's going to operate for a certain number of maybe 2 years or whatever. And you need a lot of those. You're not going to typically go to a 400 or 500 megawatt project size with one tower, because you won't be able to adequately characterize all the atmospheric conditions you're going to want have that turbine operate in. That becomes very costly for the developing community to take on. I think New Jersey has put some of its own money on the table to do that. I know that in New York we are considering that as a program element going down the road. But if you're going to look at $4 million to $6 million per tower, you probably should be looking at, as the Europeans are, different forms of measurement, LIDAR and SODAR, different technologies that heretofore haven't been widely accepted or bankable by the lending community and the financial community. So the developers won't use that. So the kind of research we're talking about today would go toward that, making that technology bankable. To the extent we can reduce the cost of that technology, then we can deploy more of it, and we can better characterize the resource, which then will allow us to understand better what these turbines are going to be operating in. What's that environment like? Because you have to learn about how they'll operate from a perspective of generating energy, the actual energy you want, as well as their lifetime. Can they survive those conditions, the dynamic loading that the resources will impart on blades and other components? Mm-hmm. But those are very, very critical pieces that are necessary if you're really going to see an offshore vision, because that's a very, very high-cost, high-risk enterprise for a developer to come in and take on. Those are the kinds of things that the federal government, leveraging with state funding like NYSERDA's funding, I think is a better space for us to play in.
Great. Dr. Swift, anything else to add on that? Or?
Yeah, I echo everything that my colleague said here, and we've been looking at wind resource measurements in the Gulf, and it is expensive. There is an opportunity, I'm really repeating here, for new technologies. We've talked about air-mounted technology to scan and look at resource, but there's also the lifetime issue. The Gulf has a lot of hurricanes. Great wind resource, but the extreme events, a lot of the people in our center do a lot of work on hurricane research and investigation. People think the wind is just a uniform front of wind. You know, the wind is the wind. It's very complex. There's a lot of structure embedded, and we have to understand these things better if we really want to make these kind of investments and make sure they can survive the environment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. Dr. Ehlers.
And as you can see from the testimony and the comments, that once again Michigan has the best answer. Just a few comments. First of all, simple is better in general. And I appreciate the role of wind. I think it's a very important component. I think we're very far along in wind energy. But I think if you look at the grand scheme of things, you have to decide that solar has potentially more advantages. Now, I'm really puzzled why our nation has always felt that the way to get solar energy is to pave over Nevada or Arizona, build a big facility, put the energy into the grid, and that this is the way to go. I don't think it is. As Mr. Schwabel mentioned about solar energy, it's very important to note. And I don't recall the exact amount of energy hitting the Earth per day now. You can give that to us later or give it to me later. But I know it's an immense amount of energy from the sun. Hits the Earth every day, constantly. And a lot of people worry about clouds, but solar energy can work through the clouds too. Maybe not as efficiently, but it'll work. But the difficulty with solar energy, there are two problems. One, it is very diffuse, so it's all over the Earth. It's not localized. And the second problem is that it is of low quality, which means it's low temperature. Now, you can get rid of the low temperature problem by using solar panels because you're converting the energy directly into electrical energy, converting light energy directly into it. The diffuse factor, I think, is best handled by making certain that, and this is my dream for this country, that every house within a few years will have solar shingles instead of asphalt shingles. As soon as we get the price down so they're comparable, that's just a very common sense thing to do. If energy is diffuse, then collect it in a diffuse manner and stop worrying about paving over Nevada to collect the solar energy. I think this is the direction in which we have to go. Whether or not we can conquer the cost problem, I don't know, but I know as long as we're doing research and we keep trying, we're likely to get there. I think the single biggest problem for both, however, is the one that Mr. St. Cross referred to earlier, and that's a storage problem. He referred to batteries. Batteries are very problematic. They're expensive, they're heavy, they don't last that long. Unless you can develop deep discharge, they're not terribly efficient. So maybe batteries are the answer, but we have an immense amount of research to do there if we're going to use them. In Michigan, we tried to solve it with pump storage plant, which has worked rather well. except that it kills an excessive amount of fish. We have handled that, but it's a good way to do it. But what I've said for 30 years, what this world needs is a good, efficient means of storing electrical energy. And if you do that, both solar energy and wind energy and other forms of energy become much more viable. And that's where a lot of our research efforts should be. I've pontificated, and I ask if there are any responses, particularly negative responses. Mr.
I would concur with your characterization for solar. We have a solar program in New York, and it is diffuse. We have a large residential program, but the market is not really, in terms of funding, it's not a significant duration or scale for us in New York to drive the kind of cost reductions that we need. So we're providing about $3 a watt as an incentive against the other federal and state tax credits to bring that market to bear. On storage, I did mention the battery storage. Most of the work we're doing now is related to transportation. But if we look at the offshore picture and we look at things like smart grid, we look at residential-based storage mediums, or even plug-in hybrid vehicles. To go to again, that's still there's still batteries, but I think we have some interesting ideas floating around that we at NYSERDA are trying to engage on in batteries and storage, working with the utilities to the south and LIPA and Con Edison. So I agree with you. So I think that storage is important. I think in New York we've looked at storage into the large reservoirs in Hydro-Quebec, but that would require transmission, which in itself has its own set of issues that must be addressed. Most of them is cost and perhaps political. But, we have reservoirs there. We can pond wind, but that will take, a multi-state effort and some, what I call old-fashioned integrated planning, which is what I spent a lot of years doing in the utilities. So I think that you're dead on when you make those statements about storing this energy.
Let me just use the few seconds remaining to thank the panel. I very much appreciate your testimony. You're right on. You understand the issues. I wish more Americans understood the issues, and I think if they did, we would be putting a lot more effort into both wind and solar energy as the viable alternatives of the future. So thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Mr. Ehler's closing remarks demonstrate yet again that great things do come from Michigan. Thank you, Dr. Ehler. Ms. Giffords.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect to Mr. Ehlers, my good friend, who made this comment about the home state of Michigan, I just would do a shout out to Mr. Lockard from the state of Arizona, and also Mr. Zweibel, who wrote the Solar Grand Plan, which is about the state of Arizona and the plan that we could produce. So those are fighting words. I'm very proud of the work that's coming out of my home state. Also, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a comment.
I'll match you dollar for dollar.
Okay. This is the first time, I think, in really any committee that I've been in where the average age of the audience is under the age of 30. So I want to thank all of the people for coming here today. It really reflects the future of our country and this interest that we have in renewables, and what an excellent panel we have. Earlier today, I had a chance to meet with one of the branches of the military, specifically talking about what the plan is for renewables, and it's very, very exciting. I noticed in the comments made by Mrs. Bacon, actually I think in the written testimony as well, that the federal government is the largest consumer of electricity, around $6 billion, and of course the Department of Defense is the largest user of renewable of all energy, not just electricity, and that's a concern. Now, I know a lot of the members don't have time to actually read everything that's in our packets, but it's really important to look through what happened, the story which happened in the 1980s when the DoD became concerned about the Japanese semiconductor industry and the manufacturers limiting access. And with this concern, we worked together to create a national roadmap for semiconductors. And so my first question, which goes to Mr. Zweibel and also Ms. Bacon, is if you can talk about this plan, how, basically, briefly, how it worked for the semiconductor industry, but more important, whether or not that road mapping plan is a good idea for solar and what that could possibly do for us.
Very much. The idea of a roadmap is to try to address the critical issues with the best of your productive capabilities. And in the past, I think that we have had a number of activities in solar energy that have been reaching out in many different directions without necessarily a central theme. But we've reached a stage now where the central theme is deployment on a scale to meet greenhouse gas emission issues and energy stabilization. So we have a mission now that's very clear, and we have a set of technologies that are excellent, that are capable of meeting that mission. So it's time for us to get serious about a technical plan, a roadmap that can be capable of supporting those successful goals. So whether or not it's semiconductor analog, it basically needs to be a focused plan with clear goals of successfully being able to reduce the cost of solar energy. Now, I want to take a moment to say that there's been tremendous progress in the reduction of cost of solar energy that wasn't that obvious during a period of boom when prices were rising, but in fact are now becoming obvious now that the demand worldwide is hurt by the financial recession. So that solar energy prices at the system level are dropping and have dropped in the last 12 months and the next 12 months by about 30% from about a year ago. So systems that used to be going in at $5 to $6 a watt are now going in at $4 a watt, and systems are being talked of at $3 a watt. There's a substantial amount of progress technologically that was hidden. We have the opportunity to take those $3 and $4 watt systems today and bring them down to $2 a watt. And I might say that at $2 to $3 a watt, those systems are going to be quite competitive with, say, for example, offshore wind, which is another very large source of energy. So I think we're that close to being able to use solar energy for these big terawatt-hour scale demands. And if I might just add one word about paving over the desert, we've put in 1% of our land area behind dams during a time period when the rest of us weren't paying attention. As you heard earlier, 1/4% would produce all of our electricity in the United States if used for solar energy. For dams, it produces only 7%. So I guess we were more liberal back then about putting in dams than we would like to be now about putting in solar energy. So I suggest we can have it all. We can have rooftops, and we can also have large fields.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we hear from Ms. Bacon? I know the time's short.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think also I would echo much of what Ken said as well, is I think that it is time for a solar roadmap. I think it would be very critical to have the right investment, the right coordination, and the right direction for us to be able to move ahead to be getting to grid parity with photovoltaics without any subsidies. And that's really what our goal is as a company. We have a path that we're working down. We'd be very interested in working with the U.S. government, not just DOE, but across applications. You mentioned DOD, and DOD being the largest user of electricity, I think, in the world. As I mentioned, they could change the way that we create electricity, just like they changed the way we communicate with the internet. It would have a massive impact on the whole solar industry. And I think we need that roadmap. We need to make sure that we're all working not just on the cells and modules, the whole system. What's important to people is the cost per kilowatt hour, and that's critical. Not, and ask is your coal-fired plant or your gas-fired plant 80% efficient or 60% efficient? What the consumer cares about is what's my cents per kilowatt hour. So we need to look at all of this. We need, I think, a neutral party that can really look through this, help us with the direction as a nation to be able to do this. And we very much are in favor of it. We'd love to participate on it. We've had a wonderful, rewarding relationship with the DOE and the DOD, but it's been small, and I think that it's time with the energy security benefits, the climate benefits, the economic benefits, the health benefits, as I mentioned, because of what we're dealing with in terms of air pollution, aside from the climate change. And, finally, we talk about DOD. I have no idea how much the DOD spends looking at all of those bad parts of the world where we get fuel, but I think there's also savings there. So a group that is looking at a solar roadmap at a high level, making sure they get the right technical and economic and other experts together, I think would make a major difference in terms of moving these industries ahead, particularly in solar, but obviously wind as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Giffords. The chair recognizes Mr. Neugebauer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Swift, I want to go back to something you said during your testimony. You said something about, it's important that when you're looking at research, not only to look at the efficiency of the turbines, the devices, I guess it would be, but also to look at the research of making sure that the wind farms and the configurations and all of those things are equally as important. Are there ways to pick up efficiencies, and are there things to learn from the farms as well?
Yeah, thank you. I really believe there's a need in this country for at least one and probably several national research wind farms in order to address this issue. I pointed out these array effects. There are siting issues. There's modeling that needs to be done. The tools that we have available right now just do not give the optimum performance, the optimum loads, which relate into lifetime, which relates into dollars. And if we can address this issue, I gave that one investment example, just a 1% improvement in performance is something like $300 million a year, given the rate that we're deploying these turbines. So at least one national wind farm where it would be publicly accessible data, researchers from across the country could do this. And I say we probably need more than one because there are different regions of the country where the wind is different. I will point out another thing, that this industry has grown really in two ways. We have an atmospheric science community. We have a wind power community. There's an opportunity for these two to come together and work in ways that they haven't. And part of it's just history, atmospheric science. You have a lot of scientists who look at boundary layer issues. We really haven't established the communication links between these, and I think this national research wind farm could address some of these losses that this industry is seeing. And I might defer to Steve to comment on what he thinks those losses are. I've heard numbers as high as 10%.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second.
Sorry.
I'll give you back enough time, Mr. Neugebauer. What we have right now is a motion to adjourn. What I'd like to do is keep the hearing going, but if members want to go do the vote and then come back, then, so if some members want to go, we'll do it in sequence, and then we can keep the hearing going. And so I think you'll be up next on our side if you want. We've got about 10 minutes to go, so we'll, Mr. Neugebauer, continue with your questioning, Ms. Edwards, and then when others come back, we'll cycle back in. I apologize for the interruption, but we can do it that way. Mr. Neugebauer, please continue.
Yeah.
We'll add some time to your clock.
Mr. Lockhart, did you want to expand on that as well?
Yeah, I don't have much to add specific to Annie's point on the research farms that way. I do think broadening the test platforms, be it test turbines, arrays of turbines. We have a new blade test facility coming, funded now. We have a new dynamometer that's being proposed and funded. All those platforms, and the wind industry has been described to me as kind of like the automotive industry in the 1940s. It's one thing for us all to look at it and say $17 billion worth of business in 2008, the job's done. And that's not the case. So whether it's forecasting, other reliability conditions, the things we're talking about are kind of bottoms-up technical experts looking at the work saying, we've got to ratchet this industry up to be something that's really going to withstand the test of time. And I'd echo the comment across the whole range of issues, forecasting and others.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I heard many of you say, and I think is something that all of us struggle with during the debate on energy, and is making it a standalone viable industry without having to have additional incentives, whether it's tax credits, other kinds of. And so, is there what does it take? For example, let's just take wind. To get to a point on parity with, say, natural gas or coal or nuclear, because those are the technologies that are available and usable today. I mean, how are we closing that gap, or are we looking at long-term need to subsidize those differences?
Yeah, I guess a couple of comments. One is all the electric energy technologies are subsidized today, so part of this is I think it needs to be looked in that larger context. But the 20% by 2030 report required a 10% reduction in cost, 15% improvement in performance. If you combine those, you can think about we're kind of 25% away from what might be necessary to be at parity. That's not very far away, but yet scale doesn't necessarily drive cost. A lot of our costs, our raw material costs and otherwise in the industry, are going up. U.S. manufacturing is more expensive, so there needs to be innovation to drive this piece. More automation, more manufacturing technology, innovation on the product side that can drive out cost and continue to drive the engine that way.
Mr. Bacon, do you want to, or Mr. Zoe?
Something about solar. A couple of things. One is that I usually compare solar and wind against other non-CO2 sources because that helps to focus that the externalities are about, in most cases, energy independence and non-CO2, and both of them have it. So I don't usually compare with coal unless it's sequestered. All of us are attempting to bring down cost, and with a history of cost reductions, say, in solar energy, we can be confident that we're going to continue to bring the cost down approximately 20% every doubling of worldwide production. That's been the history. In fact, new technologies that have come on have actually exceeded that rate of cost reduction. So we have every intention of doing that. But for technologies like wind and solar that don't use fuel, they're not exposed to that fuel cost escalation issue, and so that moving target issue. And over the course of their real lifetime, and I've heard that almost every plant that was ever put in the United States to make electricity is still in actual use because they get re-permitted. Over the course of those long lifetimes, because solar and wind have no fuel, their costs become very tiny once you've paid off the capital costs. So actually, you can actually come to a calculation that even at today's prices, they're cheaper than using a fuel-based approach because they eventually the total investment is lower.
Just to add to that, we do have a plan to get down to grid parity without incentives, and that's got to be our goal as an industry. And those gains can be made from a number of things. One thing we do is thin film. I mean, it's literally, a fraction of the thickness of a human hair. So we're talking about very low material costs. We also need to do work on higher efficiencies, because the higher the efficiency is, the better the cost is. We're working on that. We manufacture in a roll-to-roll process, almost like you do photographic film on 1.5-mile long substrates. We're working with some technology that is VHF, very high frequency, to be able to speed up the process and still get good quality solar cells. So there's all of those things that help bring down the cost. And by the way, a lot of these have been worked on with DOE and in the Thin Film Partnership going back with Ken, as well as other things that we do in Solar America Initiative. On the deployment side, then you've got all the things that are the balance of systems, because you've got to look at everything. Just the solar modular laminate doesn't do you any good. You've got to have the inverters and all the electronics and a good way to install it and all the way through. So I think that's what the roadmap can do, because there's no one company that has every piece of that supply chain.
Ms. Bacon, I'm going to interrupt you because I want to give
No
Ms.
problem.
Edwards a chance. Mr. Nugabar, give Ms. Edwards a chance to ask questions and still possibly make the vote if she chooses. We're down to about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I hope this is as profound as it needs to be, having interrupted you. My question actually has to do with what consumers really see. I mean, most people I know, when they flip on the light switch, they don't ask, where does my power come from? They don't care. They just want it to be as cheap and affordable as possible and for the lights to come on. And so I have a question about that relates to the question around transmission. The debate that's going on, reported in today's New York Times, the western states and the eastern states, and what's commercialized and who's transmitting. And I wonder why there isn't more discussion about decentralizing the transmission system, localizing it, so that you have the potential to use maybe limited sources of power generation that may be a mix of different things in a community, and produce and transmit and store locally. But it seems to me that all of our policy discussions involve this, intricate, nationwide large-scale transmission system that I think in the end is going to be far more expensive than if we figured out another shot. And I just wondered if I could hear your responses to that.
Well, this sounds like it was almost a planted question for me, because I love...
No, but good to meet you.
Yeah, I loved distributed generation. It just makes sense. We put photovoltaics on rooftops. Why not generate the power right where you're going to use it? You don't have the land, you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the transmission and distribution losses. Now, as solar, we're blessed with being able to do that because the sun shines everywhere. Some places better than others. Wind, they have specific areas where the wind is much better, so it makes more sense to do wind farms and then transmit it. But I think the more that we can do that, the better. And the other point of this with regard to distributed generation, you don't have to just put it on one rooftop. You can also have distributed wind, if you will, or distributed solar that can handle a community. And the other point of it is you can do it now. It's immediate. I mean, in the matter of months, as opposed to waiting for all the infrastructure investments and the permitting and all these fights about it. But I think in the long term, there's going to be a mix between centralized with transmission and also the distributed generation.
I think I'll go vote, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll hold the fort. That's why I did this, actually. I figured I'd have free reign. I stepped out for a moment. One of the issues that was raised on the wind front had to do with permitting, and we've got some wind facilities proposed in our area. And one of the issues is the regulatory agencies are telling us we just don't know the answers to some of the questions because it's a new technology, especially regarding ESA issues and migratory birds and things of that sort. Where are we at in terms of learning what can be done to reduce bird mortality? I remember years ago when the airlines discovered they can paint those little curly cues on jet engines and scare away birds. It didn't work in the Hudson River case, but apparently it's been relatively successful. What can we do? What's the state of the regulatory issues, and how do we expedite the permitting to get this technology online?
I think there's a lot of recognition in the industry from where I sit that these are issues that need to be addressed. I think if you look at the 2030 roadmap, and as Steve pointed out in his testimony, that we want to reduce the impacts of large-scale wind generation. There are some new technologies. We're looking at radar for measuring wind inflow to turbines, this thing I've been harping on this array effect issue. But those same radar can also be looked to determine bats and birds and things. And some of the new wind farms in the coastal area in Texas actually have bird mitigation radar. As they see flocks of birds coming, they can actually shut down the wind farm. I think there's a lot of opportunity here as we go forward and work with the various ecological communities, with the power people, the wind turbine people, et cetera. So, good question.
I'd like to add to one of the questions is that the agencies responsible for dealing with wildlife, they don't have baseline data.
Right.
They didn't have it onshore. In New York, we're doing post-construction monitoring at wind projects to do all the scavenging reviews to find out, to try mist netting for bats and so forth, because our agency, the Department of Environmental Conservation, really doesn't have that information. They have general ideas of where flyways are, but they've not been characterized at that broad a scale using a common set of accepted scientific principles. Now, if we're going to go offshore, the scale grows even larger. And it's something that when we did our prospecting in New York for about 30 site areas, we paid for that. We co-funded that with the private sector in the early, about 10 years ago. But offshore, that's a big expense, and it's a brand new area for people. And again, that is something that if we launch new advanced renewable programs at an organization like NYSERDA, we probably look to do those kind of resource characterizations because they don't have that data. In the industry, I think Dr. Swift identified that you can use radar, you can operate your facilities differently to address wildlife, but developers don't want to offer that without being told they have to. So the wildlife community has to be able to communicate. This is what we think we're concerned with, but they need scientific knowledge to do that.
And that would
and that's expensive.
The radar thing would presumably only work for fairly large flocks of major migratory birds. It'd be a little tougher for a marble murrelet, which is the case in our, I mean, they don't even know where they live. Right. And so the whole risk is we don't know where these critters are, right. But they are more or less in this neck of the woods, and we're afraid to chop them up with a wind turbine. And
I mean,
so therefore,
excuse me.
No, go ahead.
We're getting better at it. NexRad data, you can actually see the flocks come up at night on the radar. You can see where they move around, but then finding out what those species are is the next level. And we don't, that NexRad will just tell you there's a large body of birds coming up at nighttime, and then they'll see where they settle down. And you can plot that with technology, but you really don't know what species they are.
Mr. Lockhart, and then I want to acknowledge Mr. Diaz-Balart, or Mr., I can't remember, maybe whoever's next. Mr. Bartlett will be next. Let me acknowledge Mr. Bartlett because I've gone over my time. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you. For a quarter of a century now, I've had solar PV, and for the last couple of years, I've had a SkyStream. And I was amazed that the SkyStream produces as much electricity when the wind blows adequately as 32 60-watt solar panels, so wind potential is real. But I've been very happy with the solar PV. As Dr. Ehlers mentioned, the big challenge that faces us is storage. As long as solar and wind are trifling percentages of our total energy storage, doesn't matter. But we will one day not have fossil fuels, and so we will be producing our energy in some alternative fashion, so storage is going to become very important. Pump storage, of course, is very efficient, and where you have the topography differences, you can certainly do that. But aside from that, or just, thousands, millions of batteries in hybrid cars and so forth, I know of no silver bullet for storage. And I wonder if we are moving as aggressively on the storage front as we are on the solar PV and the wind front. There is, of course, a potential for wind that if you are widely enough distributed, that there may be enough wind blowing somewhere if you have a net which could carry the electricity. That's not true of solar, of course, because the sun shines only in the daytime. Are you comfortable that we have adequate research investment in storage? And have we taken a really good look at how self-sufficient we could be with wind without storage, with the proper kind of a net, or grid?
Yeah, I think a really important question, and one that the AWEA R&D and governing group has wrestled with quite a bit. The 20% by 2030 wind report, by the way, interesting to me, although I'm in support of cost-effective storage technology development, one thing it showed was that 20% of our nation's electricity can come from wind without storage, actually. We were surprised, I think, some of us, to see that outcome. And some of that has to do, as you said, with the build-out of transmission and broadening the market control areas and the jurisdiction areas and whatnot for transmission. So it's build-out of transmission, but also the planning and management of the broader areas. And I think from our group's perspective, cost-effective storage is something that's interesting, should be worked on, not only for transportation applications, but for megawatt-scale storage. And maybe our wind goal then becomes 30 or 40% with cost-effective storage as opposed to 20.
I would like to say that we have the same kind of paradigm in solar, that we discovered that we could do an awful lot of solar without straining the grid, without storage. But this doesn't mean we don't want storage, because your vision and our vision coincides, that we need to have some way to store these intermittents for other times. And so a proper storage research program in parallel with the aggressive deployment of solar and wind, I think, is totally desirable. And the good news is that might be in the right time frame. In other words, even if it takes 20 years to develop best new kinds of storage, we'll be ready. We won't need it all that much before then, and we'll be ready at that time for using it. So I think those kind of research programs really need to be done and should be done. And we definitely appreciate seeing you guys do that, but it should not be considered as a roadblock to deployment of solar and wind because, as the wind person said, distributed wind and transmitted solar and distributed solar can make up for an awful lot of that variation.
Just to add to what the other speaker said, I completely agree. Right now, storage is not a problem for solar except for off-grid applications. And the one nice thing about solar is it's shining during the day. It's producing electricity typically in the peak hours. So most of our applications are grid-tied. And most of the utilities in the evening do not have problems in terms of any capacity problems whatsoever. In the longer term, we certainly do need to look at that. One of the other things, as you know, Congressman Bartlett, we have done is our company also invented the nickel metal hydride battery, which is the battery of choice for today's hybrid electric vehicles. Much work is being done with lithium because the plug-in hybrids need higher capacity. We think we can also improve the nickel metal hydride battery, but when we did studies of that as well, there can be a second life for these batteries after the car is done with them, after about 8 or 9 years, when they aren't of good enough capacity for running a vehicle, they are still good enough to have a second life with solar and other things. So I think, again, some of these programs can be looked at in a very holistic approach as to how we can reuse some of these things. And actually, that's going on in a lot of places, and reuse and recycle with it. But having said that, I think in the long term, we're going to have to deal with storage, and it's not just battery storage. There are other mechanisms of storage. I don't think the funding is sufficient now, but there are choices that need to be made. And in our industry, it's not holding our expansion up or our cost reductions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. One of the major contributions Dr. Bartlett makes is he is probably more than any other member of Congress off the grid, in the sense of he has implemented this technology in his own home and provides very valuable insights in that, everything from solar to photovoltaics to wind and his vehicles, et cetera. So the solution to our energy problem is for us to all live more like Roscoe Bartlett, and we would quite sincerely would have a significant cut in energy. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this has been a very interesting panel, and thank you for this. I had some questions about storage because that seems to be a big issue. I do want to, Ms. Bacon, you mentioned about cost per kilowatt hour, and that's frankly is where the rubber meets the road. Everything else is theory in the sense. And you mentioned about how Germany, I guess, is #1 in the world now in solar. Is that correct? Do you know what their cost of kilowatt hours have they been able to bring it down to comparable to other sources of more traditional, old-fashioned energy?
Well, they are bringing it down, but the reason Germany is the biggest market in the world now is because of the policies that they have.
Subsidies.
Yes, they have a feed-in tariff,
Sure.
which basically agrees, for those of you that don't know, it will buy the power created by the photovoltaic array at very high rates to make it feasible to be able to pay everybody from the module manufacturer to the installer to the owner and the integrator and the finance.
Right. No, I understand that, but I mean, but since one of the things that we always hear about, and I heard it today, is that obviously when you have more of it, the prices should go down because of technology, and yet in Germany that still is not to the point of where it's competitive, or is it, or where are we?
It's not competitive with the grid yet, but
so of course Germany has about half the sunlight we have here, and cents per kilowatt hour is proportional to sunlight. So solar, both concentrated thermal and PV, is about 15 cents a kilowatt hour in the U.S. Southwest. And so that's getting closer to being cost effective. And that, of course, is the point, which is that good technology development can get you to cost effectiveness.
Well, that's obviously key. If it's going to be something that's going to be widespread, it has to be something that's competitive. But again, so how does it compare to kilowatt hour on regular, old-fashioned technology?
So, as I said earlier, I generally use non-CO2 to compare it because we are looking.
Well, but I'm just right. But I'm just talking about
right.
Right
so
now.
Coal is a nickel a kilowatt hour to 8 cents a kilowatt hour. Natural gas is about 12 cents for peaker. It's about 9 cents for base load, and wind is about 8 cents a kilowatt hour onshore and about in Germany, 22 cents a kilowatt hour offshore.
Okay, so we still have a little ways to go, but obviously, hopefully, you hope that technology
Right.
and R&D, which is something that I'm a big fan of, is obviously key there, because we're not there yet. I spent my formative years living in Spain, and we've seen some success stories and some dismal failures in Spain, and with their energy policies. They are now actually facing even some sporadic blackouts. Obviously, they're doing very well as far as their percentages of renewable energy, but they're having some other issues with obviously, the cost of energy, the level that the government has to subsidize it, the problem that's created for them there. Could you tell me some things that they've done right, and then some things that we clearly need to not replicate?
Spain made a big mistake in putting out a tariff that was way too high, and that's not an unusual mistake when programs are just starting, because they don't know where to put the number and they want to kickstart something. So they got a huge influx of installed systems, and that basically overwhelmed their system, and they got more than they wanted. So then in the second year, they just cut back to zero, and that kicked everybody off of the system. So instead of starting a domestic industry, they made everybody go boom to bust in about a 1.5-year cycle. So it is good to tune your incentives to being a proper size so that you don't have that kind of process. In fact, one of the best things about these feed-in tariffs is they go down every year. So they incentivize the idea that you're going to have to improve every year, and the kind of costs in PV that have come down over the last 10 years because of this have been unbelievable. They've been fabulous. So I'm very strongly in favor of the least cost to our society, and that's why I'm very much behind the idea of good technology development and good incentive programs that come down with time.
And 38 seconds, Mr. Chairman, if I may. Ms. Bacon, you mentioned about, which is really exciting, the fact of, people being able to have solar panels or on their roofs. That, I would imagine, though, is still very dependent on storage capacity, or is it the fact that they're still on the grid and it would be a complementary type system? And also, would it work in hurricane-prone areas like Florida, where we have very strict building codes for obvious reasons?
Another planted question. We are Category 4 hurricane strength, and actually we're working with DOD because they're thinking of moving a lot of people down to Guam, and they have a lot of hurricanes there. And they're lightweight, they're rugged. Senator Levin had to shoot bullets through them to show that they still work. So they're about 0.7 pounds per square foot compared to the competition, which is almost all glass-based, which is like 5 or 6. So yes, they're very rugged, and they can work with that. And you are also correct that nearly all of our customers are tied to the grid. So during the day, we will size this such that it'll provide all the daytime needs, and they buy from the grid. There are other cases that the customer wants size larger, and they have net metering. The meter runs backwards, and they have hardly any bill at all. We've also done...
Ms. Bacon, I want to make sure we give Dr. or Ms. Rohrabacher
yes.
an opportunity. Is that a version of product placement, Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This has been a very fascinating hearing. I've been in and out, but I've caught most of it. Let me just note for the record, the argument about climate change has been used several times here. Those of us who think that global warming is the biggest hoax that's ever been played on humankind do not necessarily disagree with you about developing alternative energy resources. I mean, those of us who note that it's gotten colder for the last 8 years and that CO2 in the air is supposed to make it warmer, thus, anyway, we won't go into that, but just so you'll know that those of us who reject that are committed to cleaner air and energy independence. And what's being advocated today fits right in to that strategy. So let's look at this a little bit. I'd like to ask you about open or net metering and an open grid. And what is the relationship to, where's the status today? And I'm trying to, this is where you can put into the grid and get credit for it and then have to pay for what you get out. Is that a status today in the United States?
Some of the wind colleagues might know better than I do, but there are many places that have net metering. There's a couple of ways they do it, and they're in the states, so it's up to the state to do it. In some cases, the net metering is that you can, and there are various names, by the way, for the same concept. You can run the meter backwards, so that, you know, that's one aspect. There's another way that they charge you in the evening, and then in some cases they charge you the avoided cost, which could be 2 cents a kilowatt hour, which isn't so great. In some cases they charge you what they would normally have, or they pay you, if you will, at a higher rate. So
perhaps we should have some sort of a national standard on that would then encourage people to utilize these alternative sources. And let me ask you about your specific alternative, Ms. Brown. How much electricity does it produce?
in terms of photovoltaics, you can do it any size. We've done some things in Hawaii.
As compared to, let's say, a solar panel and a panel of that, what produces more electricity?
Well, they're both solar panels. So it's, if you want a 1 megawatt installation, you can do it with our technology, or you can do it with the crystalline glass base. As I mentioned, we did a 12 megawatt on a roof in Spain, so they can be done of any size, and that's true with any of us in the industry. So we've done some things in houses for 2 kWs.
Okay. How long does it last?
We typically give warranties in 20 to 25 years. It's a semiconductor, no moving parts, expected to last longer.
So that might last 25 years. Now, solar panels, I understand, after about 5 years, you have to replace them or something?
No, no. And the solar panels, and this is a different type of solar panel. It's a thin film on a flexible substrate.
Okay. So solar panels are not, you don't have to, whoever told me that is wrong.
They're wrong.
Okay.
They're wrong.
And
The crystalline solar panels, which have been around for 54 years, they are also warranted in the 20 to 25% range.
Is your product biodegradable after the end of that?
We don't use any toxic materials.
Okay.
I think the stainless steel is probably going to last for a while.
Okay. Yeah, the people, by the way, I believe electrification of our society is going to be the answer. And I think in the end, what you are advocating, which is trying to focus on letting everybody contribute to the grid or take out of the grid, is going to be the answer to giving people incentives to producing the electricity that they are capable of producing that is based on the technology that we are developing. I see that as the future of our country, including automobiles, I might add. However, with that, let me ask you about the production of electricity through nuclear power, which nobody seems to have talked about here today, and which seems to be a question. Some of the environmentalists who are talking about global warming never can get themselves to talk about nuclear energy as an alternative. In terms of costs, are we talking about nuclear power being more expensive than what solar power offers today and perhaps in the future, or less expensive?
There are other better experts than I on this for sure, and probably the gentleman that's sitting right next to you has a better flavor for this than anybody in the room. But there have been some studies out with nuclear power that talks about as much as 30 cents per kilowatt hour. There are some that are as low as 6 cents a kilowatt hour for new plants that are put in. So one doesn't know. In my state, Michigan, it's too bad Ehlers wasn't here when we put in nuclear. It was 3 times the budget of what was anticipated.
Chairman, would indulge me one last question. That is, I have been told, again, I was mistold about the solar panels having to be replaced every 5 years. That's clearly misinformation. But I was also told that to produce the amount of electricity that you would get from a nuclear power plant, it would take 5,000 windmills to generate that same power.
I'm going to ask for a brief answer to this.
Yes. Is that off? And what is the number of windmills that you'd have to build to produce the same electricity as a nuclear power plant?
He says go ahead, but I don't know what the answer is. What
That
I
never
do know
stops
is,
us.
yeah, exactly. So I'll keep going as well. What I know is the average wind turbine today, a 1.5 megawatt turbine, for example, generates enough electricity when running for about 300 to 400 U.S. homes. One machine.
One windmill.
One machine. These are huge. I would have brought a product today, but it wouldn't have fit in this room. They're huge machines. They're megawatt utility scale machines. And part of
So
the
straightforward
studies,
math, 1.5 megawatts multiplied
times X.
whatever.
And the other point is just there's plenty of wind resource, there's plenty of land. One of the issues that was raised earlier related to siting, and I think we ran out of time a little bit on some of the siting.
How many of those big ones that you're talking about would we have to have for one nuclear power plant to replace one?
You have a sense?
I think, the scale of nuclear is all over the board. There's big ones or small ones. If you break it down to 1 megawatt level, a wind turbine will produce about 30% of that 1 megawatt. A nuclear plant for 1 megawatt may be at 90%, 95%. So that's the difference, 3 times the energy from the nuclear fuel.
You'd only need 3 of those big turbines for one nuclear power plant?
I'm just trying to break it down to a megawatt level because the power plants change in different scale. You could, in New York, there's a 1,638 megawatt nuclear facility.
What I'm going to do at this point.
So I'm just showing that it's like a 3-to-1 type of a scale on a megawatt basis. You can think of it that way. I'm trying to make it a little simpler that way for you.
I'm in favor of distributed nuclear power.
No, I think this.
Mr. Bartlett, did you have a comment or question? I recognize you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask a clarifying question on net metering. The digital meters, do they run backwards the same way as the mechanical meters? If they do, then you really don't need laws for net metering because you'd have to have a huge array to produce more electricity than you use. So you don't need anybody's permission to have a wind machine or solar on your house and run your meter backwards. If you run it backwards more than 0, they may not pay you for that. But in any event, they can't stop you from running the meter backwards, I don't think, can they? Yeah, so if we don't really need net metering laws. All you need to do is put it on your roof and be careful you don't produce more electricity than you use, and you'd have to have a huge array to do that. Thank you. Ma'am?
We've had an excellent hearing. I actually have just a couple of more brief questions. I don't know if colleagues would like a second round. With the indulgence of what's that? I'm going to ask just one more to follow up on a question I raised earlier, and I'll give other members opportunities if they want follow-up questions as well. I had asked a question about export of technologies earlier, and I want to follow up on that line. Ms. Bacon, I'm a personal supporter of Buy America provisions. As you know, there are profound trade implications, and in your particular business, given what you said earlier about the amount you export versus import, there'd be a pretty interesting cost-benefit question for you about that policy. On the wind side, my understanding is we, i.e. in the U.S., did a lot of the early work on wind, and a lot of that's now been exported, and the main jobs coming from wind in my district are longshore jobs. That's quite true, importing blades and towers, et cetera. What can we do as we move towards a green economy, cognizant of Buy America, but also cognizant of protectionism issues and WTO? What else can we do to make sure that if we come up with newer technologies, we don't end up importing that technology like we import so many other things?
Yeah, I think wind for sure offers a unique opportunity for domestic manufacturing. The physical product size, the blades are huge. They weigh 15,000, 20,000 pounds apiece. The towers are difficult and expensive to transport. So the trade-off is labor cost versus transportation cost, net of incentives, if there are any. And the other truth is we don't like it. Mexico's cheap. Right? So in the end of the day, and these products are fairly labor intensive, as it turns out. So I think what can we do? We talked a while ago about the Renewable Electricity Standard, just some strong long-term fundamental policies that causes boards of directors to make investments in the U.S. for long-term periods of time. That's one. The other is just to help incentivize or create more competitive U.S. manufacturing. There's a technology angle to that. The plant we opened in Newton, Iowa, there were state and local incentives that didn't match one-for-one, matched maybe 1/4 to 1 of the investments we made as our company, but it was still an adequate incentive to cause us to not build that plant in Mexico and instead build that plant in Newton, Iowa. So I think the wind opportunity offers a unique opportunity because of the transportation cost. The rest of it's on the policy side.
The key point about that from the article in Harvard Business Review and elsewhere that I've read a lot and spoken to people is we may think, oh, we're going to develop the technology here and we're going to just export the manufacturing. Well, when you export to manufacturing, you're exporting the seed corn for your technology, because you just have to interact on a daily basis with the manufacturing to get the feel for how it works. And so this myth that we're just going to do all the smart stuff here and export the manual labor outside, eventually the smart stuff's gone too, and you got nothing left. Is that a fair concern? Any other comments on that before I recognize colleagues?
I would just say that we lost the market leadership in these technologies, so they built the plants elsewhere. Where they build them, they often incentivize them. In Germany, they incentivize 50% of the capital cost. They build them in Michigan, they incentivize in Michigan. The cost of transportation is an avoided cost in all these cases, so we should take advantage of that. And in the case of PV, it's not a high labor cost, so it's a technology that we can do here in the United States and be competitive. But I do think that you're right. This is a national issue. It's not an issue for just renewable energy. It's an issue for our country, and it's much bigger than we are.
I hope to have some further hearings on that topic. Dr. Swift, did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the university side of this. You know, as university programs depend on research, which was pointed out before, that brings programs, that brings students, that brings technology innovation. Once you have a trained workforce, companies are very, very interested to co-locate where that trained workforce is. So there's a huge education piece that we need to remember, and that's directly related to the research piece, at least at the university level.
Excellent point, Doctor. Mr. Inglis, recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think next week we're going to have hearings on the grid, but the connection here to wind and solar as to the grid is I understand that there's some question about the ability of the grid as it exists now to accept many, many sources of electricity in a distributed system. Is that right? I mean, there's a question about the ability of the grid to accept all that power?
That is a key issue. After the cost issue, that's the biggest challenge for all of us, is to how to get beyond a certain level of penetration without destabilizing the grid. And so what you do there is a couple of things. First of all, there's a natural tendency to want to deal with with smarter grids that can handle faster decision making. So there's a smart grid aspect that actually goes back to the person who's dispatching and what the resources are that they're dispatching. The second thing was mentioned earlier on wind is now starting to happen in solar, and that's solar forecasting. So when you can forecast the intermittency, then you don't have the spinning reserve spinning all the time waiting for that cloud to come over, that cloud bank to come over. You only turn them on a half an hour before it comes over because you know well enough when it's going to come over. So there's a lot of work being done on solar forecasting. It's very valuable. So these things get us up towards those high levels of penetration that we were talking about, whether it's 20%, 25, 30, 15%, it's somewhere in that range that you can do without storage. Once you get to that point, though, you're going to start looking at storage, and you're going to start looking at distributed storage. You're going to start looking at issues with transportation, like using batteries for plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles for some of that storage, so that you move into that next level where you solve those grid-related problems. And as I said earlier, I think the good news is, and I think this is rare, that we can do almost as much solar and wind as we want for the next 10 to 15 years and not really shoot ourselves in the foot on this while we're doing the R&D to get the storage right. So let's do them both. Let's try to chew gum and walk at the same time.
Dr. Bartlett?
Thank you. As you've noted, for the moment at least, when you're grid tie, you're using the grid as your battery. And what you're doing is simply forcing the electric producers to modify their production to be consistent with your sporadic production. And for a long while, probably, 15, 20 years, we'll be okay there. But it may take that long or longer to develop alternative storage technologies, and we need to get going. And my perception is that we aren't getting going. I have the largest HUF1 solar home-size batteries that they sell. These are lead-acid batteries. Still, nothing competes with lead-acid batteries for storage per dollar. You can't put them in a car because they're too heavy, but storage per dollar, nothing competes with lead-acid. If you're going to store huge amounts, you're still not going to do it there because it just takes far, far too many. There are a lot of creative technologies out there, like pumping air pressure into some big thing, like having a water tower with with a membrane on top and loading it up with steel, which is 7 times as heavy as water, and pumping that up so that it gives you the effect of a very high water column. I have noticed no broad area solicitation that's asking for creative solutions to this energy thing. Have I missed something?
Well, I can comment with respect to New York State. I mean, New York State is installing a 20-megawatt flywheel system in eastern New York State to be able to address very immediate perturbations in the system. We do have a lot of interest for compressed air energy storage with some of the utilities in upstate. We've funded some high-level feasibility analyses, but right now we're looking for our Greenhouse Gas Initiative programs. We are sitting on about $127 million right now at NYSERDA. We have an operating plan that we've not launched yet because the cap-and-trade program in New York it's under lawsuit right now. It's being challenged legally. But the compressed air energy storage program is a component of our advanced energy supply and delivery program, as is the advanced renewables program. So we are definitely intrigued with trying to do some of that work. We have also done a lot of work on wind integration. We think we can take 10% to 15% integration in New York with wind and be just fine. We now do 5-minute and 15-minute forecasting. We've developed brand new forecasting systems so that our operators on the grid now are controlling the dispatch of wind resources. And we've also instituting a new program to actually dispatch wind, where they're actually providing price signals. When a system perturbation occurs, they are asked to back down and curtail and make an economic decision. So I think that we are getting far more sophisticated. I think we trust we can handle more wind on the system, but I think we are intrigued by storage, and we're just at the cusp of moving forward with a lot more work in that area in New York.
That's New York, but do we have a national aggressive program in developing storage technologies?
I think that's a wonderful idea. I think it really should be done, especially with the knowledge that we have time to be creative and to do a really good job instead of a kind of a cut and paste kind of job. So I think that would be a great idea. And I would also suggest that it's probably going to happen with wind first before it happens with solar, because it's going to be a long time before we're switching solar from the day to the night, but it'd be a pretty short time before we start switching wind from night to day.
Dr. Bartlett, maybe we ought to consider having a hearing on that very topic. I'd be interested in working with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that storage is one of the big challenges here. And the quantity and quality of energy and fossil fuels is just incredible. And when we are forced, as we will, eventually we will have a world in which we are not using fossil fuels. Geology will assure that. And when that time comes, we're going to have some huge storage capabilities, or we're not going to be living the kind of lifestyle we live now. And it may take quite a long time to develop these, and so we need to get started. Thank you.
Dr. Swift,
I just wanted to comment and support the need for a storage program. I served on a DOE wind review panel, and there was a significant discussion. And really, just to make the point, most people in the wind community feel that it's kind of the same consensus. We don't need it right now. We need to use wind research dollars to address wind-specific issues. Storage needs to address somewhere else. So I would support the idea very strongly for an independent hearing and some real focus on storage itself. Thanks.
I would be happy to work with the gentleman. As always, he's got, I think, a very important insight there. Any further comments or questions, Dr. Bartlett, before we close? With that, I want to thank the witnesses for a most informative and interesting hearing. Thank you for your time. Thanks for everyone else who attended today. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for answers to any follow-up questions the subcommittee may ask of the witnesses. With that, the witnesses are excused. I thank my colleagues for their participation, and the hearing is now adjourned.